What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel and a brand new video. In this week's video, we'll be taking a look at how I built this absolutely massive hall tree. This thing was 9 feet wide and a little over 7 feet tall. It's made primarily from birch, poplar, and oak, and in this video, I'll take you through every step and show you exactly how I built this thing. So with all that said, let's go ahead and get started. So because this hall tree was so massive, it needed to be built in 2 sections that would come apart, which would make it easier for me to move around and deliver, but also to build. In the first half of this video, we'll focus mainly on building the bottom bench section, and then we'll move over to the top section a little later in the video. And as far as the actual build process goes, so first we're going to take a bunch of birch plywood 3/4 inch sheets and we're going to break them down into usable pieces. So the pieces are first ripped in half down the table saw, and then because I can't cross cut something 8 feet long on my table saw, I use the track saw to cross cut each piece to length. Here's a quick look at the basic idea of what I'm trying to do on the bottom shelves, and I'll actually make 2 of these cabinets and then glue them together to make one big cabinet, again because it's much easier for me to handle everything that way. I'll be using dado groove joinery to assemble all of these panel pieces together, and the way that I like to do it is to set the width of the dado blade exactly the same as those plywood sheets, then leave a 3/4 inch gap between the fence and the blade. That way, whenever all these pieces are finally put together, you won't see the end panel where all of those laminated pieces are glued together on the plywood. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I've watched several cabinet building tutorials and videos, and one thing I've noticed is that nobody else does it this way. So I don't know if that makes me a genius and that there will be a cabinet building revolution with the style of how people do things after everyone sees this video, or maybe I just do it the hard way and everybody else has a way easier way figured out how to do it. But regardless, this is the way that I like to do it. I think it's actually kind of fun to do it this way, and these dado grooves make everything incredibly sturdy, and there's absolutely no give whatsoever once all the pieces are glued together. Speaking of gluing everything together, you'll first want to test fit everything to make sure that it does fit, and I was about halfway through this test fit when disaster struck. Now, if you frequently watch my videos, you know that I may have a small tendency to exaggerate just a little bit, and I don't know that calling a panel falling out from the frame would be a disaster. Maybe if it was at the very end after everything was glued and finished and it fell out, that would be more of a disaster. But anyway, getting back to the actual video, so I cut out some more panels and then I used the cross-cut sled to make sure that everything was the exact same length before putting them in the bottom portion of the bench. Just as a side note, I use this crosscut sled all the time. I made a video on that a couple weeks back, so you can check out that video at the top of the screen if you'd like. Also, if you're interested in any of the other tools or products that you see in this video, you can check out the description where I have a link to every single product that I used in the video. So with all of the panel pieces and dado grooves cut out, the next step in this build process was to glue everything together, which you can see that I've done here. And like I mentioned earlier, because this thing is so big, being 9 feet wide, it was much easier to make 2 smaller cabinets and glue them together in the middle, rather than try to make one giant cabinet and get all of those lines and seams and dado grooves lined up exactly the same. To be completely honest, I don't think that I have one single completely flat surface in my shop whatsoever. So I glued these together standing straight up, using the straight edge to make sure that all the seams were lined up with each other, rather than gluing them up flat on an uneven surface that might throw things off later. While those cabinets were gluing together, I went ahead and milled up some rough sawn poplar to make the face frames of these. So in the milling process, we first cross cut to a rough length, joint one face, then one side, head over to the planer to plane the opposite side and make it match that joint face, And then finally we'll go over to the table saw and rip everything to the width that we need for the face frames, which for me is just a little over 1.5 inches wide. So that bottom section that I just glued up was still clamped together while the glue was drying, meaning that I couldn't put the face frames on at that time, so I went ahead and started on cutting the panels out for the top section of this haul tree. So these top panels will be the same width as the bottom panels, except for the fact that I won't have that double joint by gluing the cabinets together on the top section. So I added around 1/8 of an inch or so to the width on each one of these top panels, so that the top section would end up about the same width as the bottom section. And with all of those back panels cut out, it was time to move on to the more tricky section, which are those middle interior support beams with the curved part on each one of them. So I need 4 of these interior pieces all together, and in order to waste as little plywood as possible, rather than cut out 4 individual pieces and then cut 1 beam out of each of those, I cut 2 panels out that would be just wide enough to where I could actually cut 2 of these interior panels out in opposing directions to where the offcut would match up, leaving just a small section of waste on the inside. So using my compact router with a spiral bit and a homemade circle jig, I cut out half a circle which would make the curved section, then I just lined the panel up back on the table saw and cut off the excess. You can see here that there is a little bit of a ledge, and I knew that this wouldn't line up perfectly, but I just wanted to get it close enough, and then I finished it off with a handsaw in the end. These interior support pieces would also get a dado groove on each side, leaving a 3/4 inch gap just like all of the other panel pieces. And if all of these different panels and different dado grooves all over the place don't make a whole lot of sense, here is the actual assembly process of me putting everything together. So the back panels fit into each of the dado grooves on the interior panels, and after they were held in place temporarily with the clamps, I used about 1,000,000 brad nails in each groove that I could get to. You can also see here that I cut some 2x4s to width, the same exact width of each of those panels, just to hold everything in place while I have the clamps on, because this can be a little tricky to get everything glued together and hold it tight as it's gluing up before everything sets up. As those back panels were setting up, the glue on the bottom shelf was dry, and I could take all the clamps off and set that thing down and get started on building the face frame for that bottom shelf. So each piece was cut to length using the crosscut sled, and normally I would cut 2 really long beams across the horizontal section of each shelf. But this frame needed to be 9 feet long, and all of the lumber that I had was only 8 feet long. And to my knowledge, there is not currently a way to cut an 8 feet board 9 feet long, so I just did it this way instead. To assemble the face frame, I'm putting dominoes on the end of each piece of the face frame. Now if you don't have a domino, don't worry, there's several different ways that you can do this. You can use pocket holes, dowels, brad nails, or you can just glue everything together if you're able to hold it in place. But the easiest way that I've found to do this, at least for me, is to use the dominoes with the domino setting on the loose mortise joinery. That way that there's a little bit of wiggle room after you put each one of these on. Now normally I would glue the face frame together on my workbench, then move it over onto the bench, but I wanted to see if this way would be any more efficient or a little bit faster. Turns out that it actually wasn't any faster at all, so if I was redoing this, I would glue everything together on the workbench first, then go ahead and move it over to the frame that is going on. After everything was finessed into place and there was a perfect overlap from the face frame onto the actual frame of the cabinet, I put a clamp on about every piece that I could get a clamp on, and then once again, using way too many brad nails, I secured everything in place to let the glue dry. So this is only the second hall tree that I've ever built, and a few months back when I built that first hall tree, this was by far the hardest part of gluing everything together. And with that first tree, I put the panel in first, then tried to clamp everything together, and I knew that I needed to do that differently since that barely worked last time, so I clamped it together first with spacing in the middle of where that panel would go, and then I just slipped that panel right down in the gap, which ended up working so much better than the first go on that other hall tree. To help keep everything in place during the glue up, but also to give the hall tree a finished top panel look, I cut off a few more plywood panels and glued them in place, as well as used some screws to hold them permanently to the top while all that glue from the main frame dried. So at this point, the bottom bench frame as well as the top section is basically finished, other than the bench top, which you can see me making here. So this is made out of rough sawn red oak, and I wanted to try to avoid using my jointer here just to see if I could do it. So I used a track saw to cut a flat line on each of those boards, and the problem with what I had here was, once again, that bench is 9 feet long, but all the lumber that I had was only 8 feet long. So I cut all the boards out and then staggered them on the ends, similar to how you would either see brick being laid or panels on a floor. And then this top piece will be glued together using dominoes in each one of the boards for alignment purposes. Even though I'll be running this entire panel through the planer, I like to use this as practice during my glue ups. And it turns out that even Allen Iverson agrees with me.
We talking about practice.
But in all seriousness, whenever you're working on something, if you can do something a little bit sloppier and know that you can get away with it by cleaning it up later, don't necessarily leave it sloppy. Try to make it the best you can and use it as an opportunity to practice for whenever you can't clean it up or it doesn't fit through the planer in this example. That way you have more experience with whatever you're trying to do and you know exactly what to do in order to accomplish that. So I put all the clamps on, let everything dry for maybe a day or so until the next day. Then I took the clamps off, ran the track saw on one side, and like I mentioned, I'll be running this all the way through the planer in order to get a nice level surface on both sides. The next step was to flush cut each end to the appropriate length, and you can see here in this shot that of course I happened to cut right on top of the domino that joined those together, so I did recut that, which you didn't see in the video, but then I used the small round over bit to round over a nice edge profile on the top of this and get it ready for stain. For whatever reason, after sanding the top down to 120, I didn't want to stain it at that point in time, so I jumped back over to the main panel frame and I added some birch edge banding onto each of these. Now last time when I did this, that edge banding did not want to stick whatsoever to the curve, so you'll see me put some putty over those curves a little later in the video, but for right now, all you need to focus on is that edge banding, which goes right on the side. You heat it up with an iron to activate the glue, and then you use a flush cut trim tool to cut the edges off and make it line up with the edge of that plywood. Because these pieces I'm putting in are made from plywood, there is no concern of wood movement, so I just measured equal spacing on the top, bottom, and then used a scrap piece to measure a gap in between, and I used brad nails and some glue to secure each piece in place. I know you were anxiously awaiting for how I covered these curves up when I mentioned that I would show it later in the video. So I am using DAP Dry Deck spackling here. This stuff works awesome for filling brad nail holes, which you'll see me do here, but as well as using it to hide the ugly edge of the plywood on those curved surfaces. This stuff works great. It dries fast and sands out easy, and I would highly recommend this for anybody wanting to cover up those brad nails or fix any unsightly gaps that you may have on your cabinets. So we are just about at the point where we can call this entire frame finished, but I wanted to put an upper piece of trim on the very top section of this, and I needed some more support. So I tacked some scrap pieces of plywood down on the top that would never be seen. And then I'm just using a flat piece of wall trim to go around the top to cover this thing up and give it a nice detailed trim profile around the top. With that top panel in place, I once again used that putty to cover up the brad nails, and then it was time to paint everything. So I'm using my HomeRite Super Finish Max paint sprayer. I used 2 coats of primer on each section and then 2 coats of white latex paint. And with everything painted, we could move back to the top section. I'm using Rubio Monocoat Chocolate here. And if you are unfamiliar with Rubio Monocoat, it is a wax oil combo that dries to a very hard finish. It's incredibly easy to use. It is a little bit expensive, but it is truly a 1-coat process unless you want to use the maintenance oil. And I would highly recommend using Rubio despite the price. It is well worth it in my opinion. This is the maintenance oil that I mentioned, which is applied the same exact way. And I personally like to use this on each of my pieces because it ups the sheen a little, and I think it makes the top piece look like a finished furniture product rather than having a little bit of a flat finish that some of that Rubio will leave. These are the hooks that I'm using for this. So they have a keyhole slot on the back on 2 sides. So first I needed to find the exact center of each piece of the middle brace and then mark the offset from the keyholes on each side. I believe this was 1 5/8 inches on these specific hooks. And then I could just drill right down into the middle on a consistent depth from the top of that shelf. Put a couple of screws in for that hanger to hang off of, and then put it right over top where those keyhole slots will pop right in there and that hook will slide right down. And here is proof that the hook indeed does work like a hook. And if that isn't what you would call grade A quality control, well, then I'm not sure what is. All I needed to do now was to secure the top of the bench to the bench, so I clamped it down in place, and I'll be attaching it with screws in the front, up underneath through the cubby in the front, and then around back I'll be using expansion brackets, which will allow for wood movement in case that top does expand and contract with temperature and humidity differences and everything of that nature. The very last thing that I would need to do is to bolt some support pieces to the back. Now I'm not going to do this in the video because I have to move this, but I cut a notch out of some 2x4s and then I'll use screws to attach the bottom and the top pieces together. So here are some final pictures of how this thing turned out. I'm really happy with the end result. Looks awesome. Had a ton of fun building this. If you enjoyed this content, let me know. Drop a comment down below and let me know what you think. As always, thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And of course, stay tuned for more.